Thank you all so much for coming. Good evening and welcome. My name is Michelle Gunn. I am the Director-Curator at the ICA at NYU Shanghai. On behalf of the organizers and our presenters, I want to thank you for joining us here tonight when there are so many other events happening this evening and this week. Tonight's event is the second annual art and panel discussion organized by NYU Shanghai to coincide what is informally known as Shanghai Art Week. Last year, the panel discussion, Art and Globalization, reflected on the effects of globalization on the production of art from the viewpoints of an artist, critic, and curator. This year, our panel discussion, Art and Value, will examine the consumption and valuation of contemporary art, or more simply, we ask each of our esteemed panelists, how is the value of art determined? But before I go further to introduce the question at hand and our guests this evening, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our collaborators who've helped organize tonight's event. This year's event is co-organized by the Center for Business Education and Research, also known as CBER, the Arts and Sciences, and the ICA at NYU Shanghai, with additional support by the Humanities area. Professor of Arts and tonight's moderator, Maya Kramer, and I would like to thank Dean Yuxing Chen, where are you, Dean Chen? And Emily Liu of CBER, Arts Area Head and Professor Monica Lin, and Humanities Area Head and Professor Dwayne Corpus. We'd also like to acknowledge the effort, time, and care taken by our colleagues in the University Events Office, Maria Jensen, Jennifer Chen, Shelley Shea, and Henry Zhang. And of course, we are all extremely grateful for our esteemed guests here tonight with us, Svetlana Kharchenkova, Mei Jianping, OlavVelthuis, and Kejia. I'll try to keep this short because we are running a bit late. So to introduce the program tonight, and in developing this program last year, I revisited a now more than 10 years old vintage issue of Art Forum. The Art and Markets issue was published in April 2008, just 6 months before the stock market crashed later that year. Then Chief Editor Tim Griffin's introduction to the issue noted the publication's late arrival to the discussion of contemporary art and its economy. The remarkable expansion of art's global circulation, its exponential growth in prices, its tightening grip on the popular imagination as a unique arbiter of status. All of this sounds familiar, I'm sure. The letter from the editor and other contributors reflected on how in this moment, in 2008, seemed to mark a particular zenith in the contemporary art market and signaled a particular shift, of social and political orders. 10 years later, we read the 2019 Global Art Market Report published by Art Basel and UBS, and the key highlight chosen for this press release reads, Global Art Market reaches its second highest level in 10 years amidst further consolidation at the top end. While there has been some shifting around in market shares, geographic and demographic compositions, etc. over the last decade, which again has implications for the creation and accumulation of value for art, all of this feels eerily familiar and somewhat static, including the injection within that report of cautious pessimism related to wider economic and political issues that will hamper the confidence of investors and consumers across industries and around the world. Yet, perennial to this debate, whether it's 10 years ago or now, the discussion around the relationships between symbolic and exchange value, that is for us in this ubiquitous capitalist order, and exchange value is synonymous with price, is that at least we can always count on the likelihood that there will always be for those for whom the experience of art involves some aspect of possession and acquisition, and for others whom that experience is exclusively aesthetic and or intellectual. And these are not mutually exclusive positions. Paradoxes abound. That nothing has really changed is somewhat comforting in a world where it feels like everything changes too much and too fast, though it is also discomforting that maybe nothing has changed at all. But a lot can and has changed in the last 10 years, particularly in China. And since 2008 and well before and still now, the discussion seems to hinge on a few polarities. I'll just keep it very basic, that art is priceless, but art is also nothing but its price. And if everything is changing and nothing has changed at all. So it is with these onerous but hopefully spacious terms we can have a meaningful discussion around art and value. Finally, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists in the order of their brief presentations. First, we'll have a presentation by OlavVelthuis, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam, specializing in economic sociology, sociology of the arts, and cultural sociology. His research interests include valuation and pricing, the social, cultural, and moral underpinnings of the markets, gift exchange, cultural globalization, art markets, platformatization within cultural industries, and markets for adult content. In cross-comparative fashion, he has studied the emergence and development of art markets in BRIC countries, that is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. He is currently starting a new research project on the global rise of private museums. His presentation will be followed by Svetlana Kharchenkova, who is an assistant professor of sociology of modern China at Leiden University, also in the Netherlands. Her research bridges contemporary China studies and economic and cultural sociology. In particular, she studies Chinese creative industries and cultural markets in a global perspective. She defended her PhD dissertation, White Cubes in China, a sociological study of China's emerging market for contemporary art at the University of Amsterdam in 2017. And her research of the development of the Chinese contemporary art market has been published among others, in China Quarterly, Socioeconomic Review, and Poetics, a journal of empirical research on culture, the media, and the arts. Following her presentation, Kejia, coming from New York, is a member of the faculty of Sotheby's Art Institute of Art, and an adjunct faculty member of Claremont Graduate University in Los Angeles. She is a columnist for the Financial Times China, the author of the TIFAF Art Market Report 2019, the Chinese art market, and a co-author of the Global Art Importation and Exportation Tax Report, which was commissioned by the China Association of Art Auctioneers and the Chinese Ministry of Culture. She is an expert on the global art market, and before joining Sotheby's, she oversaw the Sotheby's Institute, She oversaw Asia projects and strategies at Sotheby's in the office of the CEO while based in New York, and prior to Sotheby's, Kejia worked in Asia for more than a decade, advising various art organizations on projects locally and abroad. And then finally, our last presentation will be by Mei Jianping, who is based here in Shanghai for now. He is a professor of finance at the Chun Graduate School of Business, also known as CKGSB, Associate Dean for Alumni Affairs and the CKGSB Development Foundation, and the Director of the Chun Graduate School of Business Real Estate Research Institute. His major areas of research include international asset pricing and real asset finance. Mei was a principal developer of the Mei Moses Fine Art Price Indices, which have been covered in various major publications, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Business Week, Time, Forbes, among others. The indices have been employed by several major US and overseas banks in private banking transactions. Finally, our moderator tonight, Professor Mei Kramer, is a professor of arts at NYU Shanghai. She's also an internationally exhibited artist who has worked in curatorial departments and collections in New York, in the commercial realm here in Shanghai, and has also written for a number of international art magazines and platforms. And with that, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming our panelists and our very first speaker, OlavVelthuis.
Good evening, and thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this event, which is on a question that is really dear to me, and it's dear in the sense that when I started out as a scholar, when I started writing my dissertation, it was exactly about the question of value and valuation. It was more specifically about pricing, how galleries in New York and in Amsterdam, how they set prices for contemporary works of art. It resulted in a book, Talking Prices, that was published by Princeton University Press and actually was recently translated into Chinese, published by Little Press. So if you want to read about that, you can read the book. But one of the things I'm confronting, or I was confronting in that book, is this question to what extent or how economic value on the one hand and cultural value, symbolic value on the other hand, how those two relate. Or to put it even more simple, how price of art relates to quality. And what is striking is the permanence of a discourse, both in academia and especially in the humanities, but also in the art world itself. Not just now, but also in the history. Not just in Europe and the United States, but all over the world. When I have recently been doing research in emerging art scenes, such as the one of China, you run into the same discourse. And the discourse basically claims that price and quality don't really go together. That something, that a work of art that has a high price, well, there should be something going on with its quality. That there is almost a negative relationship between cultural value on the one hand and price on the other. Or to put it even more generally, that markets somehow corrode, contaminate value. And it is that discourse that I will be arguing against. So this may be provocative for some of you coming from a humanities background or working in the art world, but I think what I'm saying is quite the consensus at the moment in social science. And to get that critique of that discourse, that price doesn't go together with quality, to get that going, I want to take you to a stall at the, so the title of my talk is symbolic value still a prerequisite for economic value? I'm claiming that it currently is, but there are reasons to assume that maybe we're moving away from this paradigm. So I'm taking you to this little stall at Central Park in New York a couple of years ago, where you may know this from the press, that the press coverage of this, where a guy was just sitting from 9 a.m. with a bunch of artworks, and by 1 p.m. he still hadn't sold a single object. Now, at one point, at least one person, a woman, a tourist from New Zealand, was passing by and kind of liked one of the pieces, this little bear here. She liked it, she wanted to hang it in her daughter's room, so she bought it for $60 US. Now, she had to leave her address, and she was a bit puzzled by that, why you would have to leave your address if you buy something for $60 from a street vendor. But then a couple of days later, she was contacted by the artist. And she was actually contacted because the artist wanted to send her a certificate of authenticity. Now, the artist was Banksy, the London British street artist. What she eventually ended up doing when she knew that it was a work by Banksy and authenticated by him, well, she changed her mind about hanging it in her daughter's room, and she actually approached an auction house, Bonhams, with it. And that is where it was sold a couple of months later for, I don't know, is the price still here for 50, what does it say here? 56,000 US dollars. Now, why am I saying this? To make basically 2 points. First of all, for works of art to have value, it is crucial that the artist is also recognized and that the audience knows about that recognition. And I'm going to say more about that in a second. Secondly, for the value of an artwork to materialize, you need to have specific contexts. A street vendor is not the right appropriate context to get that value of Banksy materialize, whereas it does materialize in an auction house. But I want to speak more about that first point, about that relationship between recognition and price. Now, social scientific theories of art's value basically goes something like this. Here's one version by a classical book by two American sociologists, Harrison and Cynthia White, who say that with the birth of the modern art market, dealers, gallerists basically take up this role. What they need to do in order to make art valuable, in order to create a market for art, they first need to be in touch with critics. So the system of the modern art market has been called, following this book, a dealer-critic system. So that means that before a market for a modern or contemporary artist can really come into being, before economic value can be established, you first need to convince people in the art world, critics, and then later on curators, museum directors, that an object has value. So you need to make sure that recognition, artistic recognition, that people really believe in the value, in the symbolic value of a work of art. You need to have that first before something can get a price. Without that, it is very hard to get a market going. Or to put it in terms of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, you would say that first you need to create symbolic value, and that is done by institutions like museums, by art critics, by curators, by biennales, by all kinds of parties who, at first sight, seem to be external to the market. But actually, they are quite crucial for that market, because without their work, without symbolic value production, economic value will not materialize. And of course, there are many exceptions to this, but if you look at some empirical data, and I'm going to take you to a couple of those, you find quite interesting results. This is a book published in the early 2000s by an American economist, David Gabenson, who shows very nicely that if you look at art historical textbooks, that you don't only find that the artists that are included in the textbooks, that they are also artists who generally have a strong market and have a high price, but even more specifically, that the works that you see in those textbooks, that those are exactly the works, or works from that period, that have commanded the highest price. Or to put it again differently, that the judgment of art historians writing these textbooks is apparently in line with the judgment of the market. I'll give you another example of this. In the 1970s, a German art journalist called Willy Bongard started collecting data on prices of contemporary artists and of their recognition. And the recognition he did with a kind of a point system. So if an artist would have a show at MoMA in New York, he would get 1,000 points. If he would have a show at a lesser museum, he would get 200 points. And he would just total all the points, all the recognition points together, and then compare that with price levels. And again, what he found was that those two correlate very well, so that it is not the case that price and quality don't match, but that they actually match pretty well. What I did in my own research was for emerging artists, artists from emerging countries, I did more or less the same as Bongard did with his KUNSTKOMPASS. So what I did, and every dot here represents an artist, what I did was look for a group of artists, a randomly selected group, how recognized they are, so by institutions, curators, museums, biennials, etc. So how recognized they are, and at the same time, how well they are doing at auction. And I find basically two things. First of all, like Bongard, like those other scholars, I find that there is a correlation between the two. That overall, the more recognition an artist has, the higher the prices at auction are. But at the same time, you see that that correlation is not at all perfect. So you see all kinds of differences here. You see, for instance, that for Brazilian artists, the red dots, they tend to be on this side of the diagram. So that means that those Brazilian artists, they have a lot of recognition. They're doing very well in the institutional scene. They are exhibited frequently by museums, included frequently in biennials, etc. But that their price levels are not completely in accordance with that. Whereas for other artists, let's say Chinese artists, you find the opposite. Their prices, their auction performance is great, but their recognition is a little bit less so. And that would be, for me, it's a tool to start thinking, well, so maybe they don't, those two things don't correlate perfectly all the time. But there are, variations there, and they make you think. It might, for instance, mean that some of these careers of Chinese artists, that they are more commercially inspired. As opposed to Brazilian artists that have more of an institutional career. Nevertheless, basically, symbolic value on the one hand, economic value on the other, go hand in hand. The question is, if that correlation, if that is a permanent one. There are reasons to think, and that is what I will be stopping with. How am I doing time-wise? A couple more minutes? Good. There are reasons to think that that model, so this dealer-critic model, this model where economic and symbolic value go hand in hand because first you need to be recognized as an artist before you can have a stable market, that at the moment, that model is under pressure. Why? Well, because of a huge influx of new money into the market and because of a change in the importance of different institutions. One of the most striking developments, I think, in the contemporary art world globally of the last decades is, first of all, the rise of mega dealers like Hauser and Wirth, who established a couple of years ago a museum-like space in Los Angeles and are doing the same all over the world. So who are really taking up the role of museums themselves, establishing spaces that are museum-like in size, that attract crowds that are museum-like as well, that have all kinds of scholarly functions. Here you see the new headquarters of the Pace Gallery in New York, that just opened last month or 2 months ago, that has a big library, it has a performance hall, it takes up all kinds of roles that traditionally public museums would have. So what you're seeing is that while subsidies, especially in Europe, to public spaces are going down, private institutions are actually becoming more powerful, especially at the top of the market. And not only that, it's not the only private institution that is rising in power and that is putting that model of economic and symbolic value out of balance. It's also the rise of private museums, again, all over the world. And Shanghai, I mean, there could not have been a better example than Shanghai as a place where many of these private museums over the last, well, in Shanghai it's only over less than a decade, have been established. That are increasingly, as a private party, co-determining what is valuable, what enters the canon, what the public should be seeing. So what I would be hoping to talk about tonight also in the panel discussion is exactly that type of change in role, change in balance, where this previous model where first symbolic value needs to be produced and then economic value can be established, where that is now more and more being determined by an increasing power and strength of private parties. That's where I'll stop.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and I would like to thank also my Kramer and for inviting me, and also their colleagues at NYU Shanghai to organize this event. And also I wanted to say that I believe that it will be happening, so that you can join me. Alright, so what I'm going to talk about today is research that I happened to co-author together with OlavVelthuis, and it was based on almost 200 interviews which I conducted in China, mostly in Beijing, with different participants of the art market in China. So artists, curators, collectors, auction house employees, journalists who write in art magazines, etc. And also apart from these interviews, I spent about a year hanging out in the art world and trying to understand how it works. And so it's important to say perhaps that it's a bit of a historical research now, because the fieldwork was done in 2012, 2014 mostly. So since then a lot has happened. I've done some follow-up interviews, but yeah, we can see it more as a context perhaps. Alright, so when it comes to value of art, so Olav introduced us the general situation, but I'm going to talk about China. So what we found in China is that it's auctions and auction results that are really the important tools in China to judge value of contemporary art. So during my fieldwork, I met a lot of young artists who were in their 20s and in their 30s, and their work has already been auctioned. And sometimes it was very new work, so made maybe several months ago or the previous year. So this is all very unusual, actually. And so how these artists and gallerists and others explain this to me is that this is done in order to establish the price for an artist. So once you auction an artwork by an artist, you have a benchmark price. And also, it helps you promote an artist by auctioning their work really on. Yes, you have both this symbolic value, because you place an artist in this beautiful context of an auction catalog among other recognized artists, so-called as they receive it, and you also create a benchmark price for this artist. So the question is then, why are auctions so important for judging and also establishing value in China? So there are several reasons for this. So the first reason is because the Chinese art market is relatively new, and this it only emerged basically since the 90s, or you could even say 2000s. So a lot of people involved in this market also got involved really recently. And so for some collectors who are relatively new to the market, auctions seem to be quite a simple way to engage with the art world. So you can immediately see the hierarchy among the artists. You can immediately see well, the price of the artist, and it's all quite an easy entrance into the art world. So the second reason why auctions are so important in China is that other institutions, also dealer critic system, what OlavVelthuis has just talked about, it did not really emerge as strongly in China. So when I talked to my interviewees, it seemed that they didn't really take Chinese local museums or art critics very seriously. So they would have a lot of stories that artists can just pay to have an exhibition at a museum, and an art critic would just accept payments to write a positive review for an artist or just for their friends. And so there would be a lot of doubts about the quality of their work. Of course, some of my interviews, they named exceptions to this. So they would name some professional galleries, some professional museums, some professional art critics, but there would really be exceptions. And overall perception was seemed to be that these dealers and critics and museums don't really manage to help people decide what actually is good art. And so these are two reasons, but they are not really enough to understand why did then auctions emerge so strongly in China. And so the reason for that is basically the state involvement. Yeah? So the state got involved in two ways. One way is the direct support of the auction houses from the very start, and another one is social ties with auctions. So basically, auctions enjoyed government backing from the very start, from the early 90s. The first auction houses that were established not top-down by the government, but they were organized by really individual entrepreneurs in their 30s at the time, really young and ambitious and enthusiastic. But the government, instead of ignoring them or, putting some obstacles in their way, they actually really embraced this idea of auctions. So auctions were legalized very quickly in the early 90s already. Then in the mid-90s, an auction law was written. And that was done basically because auctions were mainly interested in antiques and traditional Chinese art, and not so much contemporary art. There was contemporary art at China Guardian, but it was just a little part. And for the rest, throughout the 90s, only Sungari auction tried contemporary art a little bit. It was mostly traditional art and antiques. The government was really not interested in promoting contemporary art. Contemporary art was really ignored in the 90s, so basically until 2000. It was, contemporary artists who were living somewhere out on the outskirts of the cities, outside the systems of T2Y, right? So they were not really interesting to the state. And at the same time, so it was a very new economy. Nobody was sure how economic reforms are going to go, what the legal framework for the economy is going to be. So you are in the middle of this process. And this early legitimation of auctions was really, really important to really make these organizations grow and become quite strong and powerful. And so organizations that only got involved with contemporary art, like contemporary art galleries, which existed a little bit in the 90s, they did not receive such support, right? So that's a big difference. And the second reason why auctions are, how auctions are linked to the state is social networks. So some of the auction houses were founded by the children of former political leaders, like China Guardian and Sungari auctions. Beijing Poly auction is part of state-owned enterprise and also connected with the military. And so, and of course, so it really matters, right? Because some of the collectors or aspiring collectors, they may be part or willing to become part of these networks. So once I was at an auction in Beijing. It was a poly evening auction, a very nice sale. Sale of art, and so a person sitting behind me turned out to be an aspiring collector. So he was from Sinopec, and he told me after the auction that he actually, it was the first time that he was involved somehow in art. He was trying to get into collecting, and he basically started with an auction house. So it was his first intervention. And for him, why he came to an auction house, well, the reason was that Beijing Poly had a government background, so it was trustworthy for him. And so, to sum up, I completely forgot to let it was going on its own. So to sum up, auctions are important mechanisms to judge value in China for 3 reasons. So one reason is that these very clear prices are easy to are very attractive for novice participants of a new market. The second reason is that other institutions to judge value didn't emerge. And the third reason is the support of the government. But, I can actually use this. So the situation may really be changing. And so actually it mirrors a little bit the previous presentation. So in my recent interviews, actually I found out that this situation that young artists' artworks are sent to an auction very early in their career does not really happen that often anymore. So somehow to establish a value of a young artist, it is really now rarely done to send it, to go through this very commercial route. So what does it mean? So auctions are no longer used to establish value of young artists, but it doesn't mean that the auctions are not used to judge value of these young artists. So it seems to be that, especially because the market for contemporary art in China has not been doing very well, that kind of galleries and artists and collectors are a bit reluctant to make these prices public. So because of course that doesn't help you create a good price benchmark. And at the same time there are other changing going on. Yeah? So there are a lot of museums here in Shanghai, but also in Beijing and in Guangzhou and other cities in China. And so also a lot of young, for instance, collectors who are very internationally educated, who have been interested in art for many years since their childhood, are entering the art world. They are familiar with different ways to create value. And so a lot of people in the art world told me, like last year, that now they do see a lot of professional teams in Chinese museums, or it is increasing in any case. So the question is, are museums now going to be an alternative way to judge and establish value for contemporary art in China? And are then private museums powerful enough to do that? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I know that it has been a pretty hectic week for everyone, and the traffic has been bad. I have some top collectors I wrote in my report who are still stuck in traffic. Hopefully they're going to show up soon. I want to step back a little bit before we talk about art and value. You know, sometimes, although I'm teaching our business courses at the Institute, but I spend a lot of time hanging out with artists. And I know that that's the last subject that artists would like to talk about is market or money, although they have to make a living through that. So let's step back and talk about one comment I heard from the very famous female artist. Her name is Cecily Brown. For those who are not familiar with her work, if we go back to art and value topic, I think she's represented by Gagosian, and any of her oil on canvas can be easily sold at major auction houses at millions of dollars. So I went to her talk, which was about her art creation last week in New York. And she said, she talked about New York. She's a British artist and spent 6 months of exchange program in New York when she was studying in London. And then she fell in love with the city back in the 90s, didn't want to go back. So far, she has lived in New York City for over 20 years. So she said, today, for any artist, it is a horrible time because there's just so much money circulating in the art world. I mean, it's a good thing that because money is heavily involved, so more and more people care about art. That's why we have such a turnout tonight, right? In the old days, probably not much the case. But on the other hand, it's a horrible time because artists often feel jaded, and you often get confused who really cares about art. So that's a question, I think, at least after tonight's panel discussion, and although also the Q&A session, is something you take with you. First of all, do you really care about art, right? Do you care about art because there's a monetary label attached to it, or because you really care about art? Like you go to a museum, you look at a painting, you feel the painting is really speaking to you. Because this week, when you go to all the art fairs, all the gallery shows and museum shows, you will be bombarded with tens of thousands of artworks. And at one point, you will lose your sense when you look at an object. When that happens, you might want to ask yourself, does the art really touch your soul, the work, or you care about it because there's a monetary reason associated with this? And I hope that the majority of you, when you walk out of auditorium today, it's not because there's something related to the price of the artwork that make you excited. The true value, which is the intrinsic value that both experts talk about, I think matters the most, way better, right? So it's interesting that Cecily Brown put it out last week in New York, and it is on the same day that in a private sale, Christie sold one of her paintings at $8 million. So this is the ironic side of the art market that we're dealing with. So since the whole context of today is happening in Shanghai, a city in China, so I want to talk a little bit of my research for the T5 art market report, which I presented in Maastricht in March this year. So in the earlier presentation, there was a discussion in terms of the auction market, how that pushed the price. We don't have much time to go to the details, but long story short, this is what happened to the modern Chinese art market. It's not like just, exploded overnight. There was a long tail that happened to it. And you all know that this country has a long tradition of art collecting, which happened for thousands of years, right? They're like Song Huizong in Song Dynasty was one of the mega collectors, not to mention Qianlong Emperor. And then in modern China, there's a lot happened in the 20th century. So a lot of things after the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, there's a lot of political turmoil and cultural revolution. So basically, when we talk about the modern term of Chinese art market, it's pretty much could be traced after Cultural Revolution, when different families had the chance to restitute their artworks. That's why there was Chinese antiquity shops like Wenwu Shangdian, which played a very important role of facilitating the art trade before the first auction house, Luo Yunxuan, was founded in early 90s in Shanghai. So this is the picture we're looking at of the market that we're standing today. First of all, the country has, in terms of the wealthy people, that we define as high net worth individuals. People have the net worth they can spend over $1 million. The total number of population of this demographic we're talking about is number 2 in the world after United States, before Japan. So that's based on the latest data of Credit Suisse. And secondly, speaking of the symbolic value, let's go back to private museums. The first private museum in the country was not founded until early 90s. So rather, it has a very short history compared with Europe or the United States, where today you see there are so many private museums in Shanghai. They're pretty much taking on the role of setting the symbols and also, so to speak, the symbolic value, as we talked about earlier tonight, of the artworks. And thirdly, there's just so many private museums across the country today. Based on the latest data of the Ministry of Culture, there are about 1,600 private museums in China. We don't think in the next decade many of them will be able to survive, but still, just to have those museums, it's a benefit for the general public to have so much exposure to see art. And then let's go back to the auctions. So the first auction houses in China was founded in 92, Duoyunshuan, followed by Guardian in the second year. And if you look at the contrast, so there are certain numbers in 2018, which the Chinese Associated Auctioneers didn't disclose, but we compare what happened between 93 and 2017, you see it's a tremendous leap in terms of number of auctions, number of objects being circulated, and the total sales. So it's pretty much the market has achieved exponential growth over 25 years. And it went through some fluctuation. As a matter of fact, as our earlier speaker pointed out, auction had been a major driving force for the growth of the market, which we're talking about the turnover, the number of objects circulated in the market, and the value of each object. At the moment, we are going through, the public auction in China is going through a period of adjustment. So year on year, if we look at the total turnover data of 2018 compared with 2017, it's 17% of drop. And if we look at the largest category, which is Chinese classical paintings and calligraphy, it has encountered about over 50% of a drop. We are, for this category, it's pretty much at the bottom since 2011. So it's a very challenging time, and personally, through writing this report, what I have realized that the entire Chinese art market is going through a major structural change, where in the past 25 years, it has been driven by auction. However, today we are facing a new trajectory where the auction market is shrinking or going through a period of self-adjustment. At the same time, there are blue chip galleries and art fairs which are taking more active roles of pushing the market into the private sales domain. What we mean by private sale is any transactions that happen not in public auction domain, which include sometimes artists sell works to collectors directly, or collectors trade artworks between them, or galleries sell artworks to collectors. How are we doing in terms of time? Okay, so I guess I don't have time to finish all my slides, but there are some things I want to summarize in terms of what I have discovered in this process. So during this structural change, although people are very much worried about the economic slowdown and also the US-China trade war in the past year, for the high net worth individuals that we talk about, in general, financially, they're still quite secure. So there's a very strong willingness of continue buying art because for various reasons. First of all, we're going to talk about later that a lot of collectors do see art as a way to allocate their asset either for investment purpose or for safer way to park their money, easy to carry around. And second, they want to differentiate themselves, right? In the past, if you are wealthier than your neighbor, you might buy a nicer car or a nicer handbag or a nicer jacket, but these days to have an anti-whopper in your dining room can differentiate yourself from your neighbor who might have no idea who anti-whopper is. And also, in terms of buying activity, mainland China and Hong Kong continue to be the top locations for the collectors that we're looking at to acquire art. And an interesting discovery I realized is collectors trade art among themselves all the time, which hasn't been widely reported by the press. But they admitted through the survey I conducted that a lot of the time they will, go to each other's houses and sometimes exchange artworks as a way to either refreshing their collection. And interestingly, many top collectors that I have spoken to, a lot of them are private museum owners, they admitted they don't like to read. It could be possible that many of them are business owners, so they're too busy to really spend time reading, or they said they don't take any art classes because they're just too busy running their own business or running their own museum. So it's mostly self-taught, and you will be amazed in terms of the fast learning curve they overcome over the past 5 years, so to speak, if you look at how many private museums were established in Shanghai. And then in terms of liquidation, for them to realize after a period of time, for various reasons, either to see the artwork's price increase or to enjoy the financial liberty after a period of holding time, is to sell art through auctions. So auctions remain to be the top channel for them to sell art. Is time up? Okay. So I want to quickly talk about the latest trend. So this is something interesting. I want to give an example, probably just to close my presentation. One of the collectors I spoke to, who is stuck in traffic tonight, is Liu Gang. So he has over 3,000 objects in his private collection. Back in the beginning of 1992, the government allowed private individuals to open law firms in China. So in the old days, before the law change, all the lawyers in China were public servants. So he was in the first generation of individuals who were able to enjoy that policy change. And he's a partner of a top law firm who has over 600 lawyers in Greater China. This painting he bought from China Guardian in the middle of the 90s, and he spent all his money, all his saving on the painting. So it's basically, it's a little bit like a socialist realism, and you barely see the paintings or the painters work much. So it's Gao Xiaohua's like catching the train that really capture what was like in China, if any of you have lived through that period of time. So today the painting worth over, I think, 10 times of the price he acquired, which was a cover lot he bought at China Guardian in that year. He was approached by multiple auction houses over and over, and of course, he is still holding on to this painting no matter how much the price has increased, because once he sells the painting, there's no way he can get anything like this anymore. So that's like one of the most treasured artworks, as you could imagine, by all the major auction houses in the country. And he has transformed. He's pretty much stopped buying Chinese art based on the influence of blue chip galleries, the art fairs. So we see, and that sort of transformation pretty much happened in the past 5 years. He was such a devoted collector of Chinese oil painters, and now he spent a lot of time researching and studying about Western artworks. So the installation on the left is Thomas Saraceno's work. He had a show at the Fusen Art Foundation last year, and then the work on your right is Anthony Guamei's sculpture. So with that note, I want to close my presentation. We will start our panel discussion. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you, Yuxing, for inviting me. It's quite a pleasure. I think what I'd like to talk about today is recent market performances of men and women artists. I think, let me just clarify, actually, this is not my own research, but research based on a recent study by Sotheby's, who has acquired our data and also our methodology. So this is actually their work. But let me first very briefly say a few words about the database. I think the database the database right now has roughly about 50,000 pairs of repeated sales. They are all based on Sotheby's and Christie's and also Phillips, the three major auction houses. I think right now they are updated annually, and with roughly about over 3,000 pairs of editions every year. It includes paintings, sculptures, drawings, watercolors, but no prints or photos. And the data set goes back very far. It actually goes back as early as the 17th century. At the moment, there is no selection bias. In other words, anything actually auctioned in these three auction houses and has prior sales actually goes into the database. So we do not make any subjective selections whether a painting is involved, is included or not. And also, it covers three major collecting categories: American, Old Master, Impressionist and Modern, and also the contemporary category. Basically, roughly about 20 years ago, when Mike and I started doing this work, I think we were inspired essentially for developing the Dow Jones Industrials for the art market. And this is basically, I think, what we try to do. After having this database, I think we have done quite extensive research on what drives the art market. And also based on other people's work, I think basically right now I have a rough picture of how the art market is priced, or is pricing art. I think so in my mind, actually pricing art is not very different from what I mean here at the art is just sort of art just sold in auction houses, in three major auction houses. It does not involve the things that I actually mentioned earlier that was actually sold in on the street sidewalks. I think it's just sold in these three auction houses. I think for these artworks, for me, they are not very much different from the price in Shanghai real estate or New York real estate. So I think what's mostly, I think, important factors driving the prices are world wealth growth. This is the most important factor. And for example, GDP of the major economies, stock market, taxes, inequality, as well as interest rates. So we discovered that when interest rate rises, the art market generally tends to fall. Then after that, what we discover is that actually it has something to do with collection preferences. So whether right now it's the old masters or whether it's the impressionists or the contemporaries. So the collection categories certainly goes, in fashion, so to speak. And then we discovered that actually certainly taste, when people's taste change, certainly affects sort of the prices. Then also certainly particular works of art by certain artists also matters. So, for example, this part of Shanghai, when I was born, was all rice paddies. So the value was pretty low. But then, as a result of economic opening up and also economic reform, certainly the value of this piece of land in Shanghai goes up dramatically. But also, if you tell me a specific building, whether it is IFC or whether it is a small building on a side road, I think this is sort of essentially, if you tell me whether the artist's work is involved, is published in textbook. In other words, how important is the symbolic value? I think that's also important in determining value. So that's sort of basically what we discover about how to price art sold in major auction houses. What's interesting is that actually based on this recent Sotheby's work, they studied essentially female artists as well as male artists, actually their performance over this 20-year period. What's interesting is that they discovered that actually roughly about since 1998, women artists seems to be outperforming the men artists. And the outperformance really picks up dramatically after 2012. So just give you an example. This is a piece by Lucien Freud. He was just, I think he was mocking a bureaucrat. So this benefits of supervisor sleeping. This was sold in Christie's in 2015 for $56 million. And the estimate was between $30 and $50 million. What's really interesting is that actually a work by a similar artist, Jenny Saville, actually the auction houses only gave an estimate between $3.9 to $5 million. So as you can see, roughly about an 8-time difference in price estimates. But what's really interesting is actually it was sold for $12 million, way above the estimates. So this led me to notice a very interesting Wall Street Journal research. This is the research done by myself. I was really comparing 3 companies. So the first 4 companies, I'm sorry. The first one was Procter & Gamble. The second one was Pepsi Cola. Sorry for the Chinese. I forgot to translate them. The third one is Microsoft, and the last one is Google. Okay. So, for example, Procter & Gamble investors historically invest roughly about $83 billion, and the market cap at the very beginning of last year was roughly about $199 billion. So as you can see, roughly the value increased roughly about, for every dollar of investment, the market cap last year was like $2.4. Just jump to, for example, Google. Google historically investor only put in about, the pointer is not working properly. So anyway, Google investor only put in $5 billion, but the market value was $888 billion at the very beginning of last year. So I think this comparison gives you a fairly good idea that actually, for modern times, the most important thing about company size or value is not how much the original investor put in, but actually, essentially what I attribute is essentially the unique talent working for Google. So it's the human capital that's the most valuable. But what's really interesting is that actually, if nowadays, if you look at US companies, and also look at European companies, what you discover is that women CEOs or women directors are underrepresented. And if you look at Shanghai companies, Shanghai market-listed companies, you discover that actually for 100, so in the US, for example, roughly the Fortune 500 roughly have 20% women representation. But for the Shanghai stock market, for the Shanghai Composite 300, I think 2 years ago when I was doing the research, there were 132 companies had no women directors. So women in some so if you look at the Wall Street Journal study, this is really interesting. Wall Street Journal study discovered that actually if you compare men and women CEOs working for more than a year, they discovered actually the women CEOs actually now earn more money than the men CEOs. Men CEOs. The reason they earn more, not because for some reason they convinced the board that actually they should earn more money, but actually they have better performance. So as you can see for the ROE, in other words, return to equity, return on equity, the women CEOs actually can earn a higher return on the investment. So this led me to think that actually, because of artificial intelligence, and also because of robots, and also because Google Map, all these modern technologies, they empower women. And based on this study, as you can see that actually the most important now contributing factor for firm value is human capital. So this led me to conclude that actually the human capital of women is undervalued. So going forward, we probably should go long on women, go short on men. So this is sort of essentially this is essentially my presentation on our market. But I just want to give you a sense that actually nowadays I have myself become an artist rather than just an economist. So that I have a new production company in Shanghai producing Peking operas. So in a month, we will have a production of, this is actually 2 productions I put up in Tokyo that actually I'm bring back to show the Shanghai residents. And then next March, I have another production, which is the new Dragon in the Shanghai Eastern Arts Center. So you're welcome to enjoy. Thank you.
Okay, if all of our guests would come and join us here in this seating so we can begin to talk about their talks.
Do you want to sit in a specific way? Or
Nope. I'm going to let you guys choose where you want to sit. Thank you so much for your contributions to this evening's panel. I wanted to first direct a question to you, Olav, actually. You seem to be claiming that there's this shift from like a public to almost a economic model of value. How does that actually change what's being represented within the actual art itself, or does it?
Well, so in terms of what is being presented, the honest answer, like good data on this, are not available yet, so I wouldn't be able to tell. I mean, but you can give predictions, of course. I mean, you would expect that the taste of the super rich is more and more shaping what is there to be seen in museum spaces, where public museums are usually governed in a more or less public way, so not representing the taste of one specific collector only, but representing a broader curatorial vision on what the collection should be like and what an exhibition program should be like. Yeah, these private museums, in the end, they predominantly reflect the taste of the founder of these museums, because that is not always, but usually the boom in private museums, not just in China but all over the world, is a boom in single collector private museums.
So it is changing what's being seen in the world, what's being promoted, what's being embraced?
You would expect that. At the same time, I mean, if you look at what these private museum founders are doing, and that is the big question, I mean, are they really making a new taste that others will then look at? Or are they more or less following what other people are doing. And I mean, the verdict is really not out there. So there are reasons to believe that they are not that different from the public sector. Also, if you look at the curatorial teams that they establish around them, usually they hire people away from curators from public institutions. That is, by the way, the same thing that the big mega dealers are doing. So dealers that you will find at the Westbund Art Fair now, like David Swerner or Gagosian or House and Word, they are hiring, I mean, they are really like these massive, almost black holes that are just sucking everything from the public sector into them. So when it comes to curators, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to, of course, artists sucking them away from galleries in the mid-level. So those would be reasons to think that it may not lead to a completely different taste because they hire the same people from the public sphere. But the verdict is not.
Kejia, I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the qualities of a good collector in your mind versus kind of more of a novice collector? And then also, what are some of the qualities of a good art investor versus not such a good art investor? And do they align or are they different?
In terms of a collector, I feel a good criteria will be that person is willing to learn. I mean, it sounds pretty easy, but actually for a lot of collectors, as I mentioned earlier, I did in my research, first of all, they don't read, period. They might be too busy to read. I'm talking about here in this country. And secondly, they don't take any classes. However, we all know that our history is very complex narrative, and you need to spend a lot of time on that. So I do see that's a problem, especially in the long run, that differentiate a good collector from someone who's too lazy to be guided just by auction houses or blue chip galleries.
So learning
because they don't think, right? You have to, I think is the most important thing, you have to shape your independent judgment. Apart from you're surrounded by blue chip galleries or auction houses who smell your money all the time. Second, to answer your question in terms of professional or amateur, I think there are different schools of beliefs. I'm not saying what I comment is absolutely right. So one of my good friends, who is the chairman of Phillips auction house in Americas, he used to be the worldwide chairman of Impressions in Modern Art. So I think he has been in the art auction world for over 30 years, seen it all. At one point, he himself single-handedly facilitated over $600 million of sales a year. So he says, through his 3 decades of working, at least in the modern impressions art market, he hasn't seen any art form that has been a good success story, which I'm kind of leaning toward his narrative, which is I don't believe art is in general a very effective investment vehicle, because the most important thing he has been advising all his collectors, which includes Steven Schwarzman, the founder of Blackstone, is you have to really love what you collect. You can't just treat this as a financial tool. But I'm sure maybe some other guests on the panel disagree with me, but I'm leaning toward my friend's belief. So maybe to differentiate an amateur or someone who sort of see the intrinsic value and then see the works they collect and then the value goes up, is people who are willing to invest in terms of learning, in terms of they really buy what they like, and then maybe throughout certain decades they can form a single owner collection that really differentiate what they collect from other people collected. For example, David Rockefeller, the sale, was a good story. Like, not every single work he collected was the best. For example, when you look at the Matisse, it was not the best Matisse. or he collected the Paul Signa is not the best Paul Signa. But once those paintings were in David Rockefeller's collection, you will see at Christie's they could be sold at much higher prices. So that's sort of some really savvy collectors who can develop the whole collection into a new narrative that when you look at is not just whether this is the best Picasso or Matisse or Paul Signa, but it is in his collection, the provenance will really make a huge difference.
So I think that segues into a good point. How do you determine what the best is? You know, you said that a lot of them are shown in textbooks as this is like the quintessential Pollock or this is the quintessential Matisse. But you know, what are the criteria that art historians and other people use to say this is the best? This is the best Warhol.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a very complicated question. By the way, so for me to emphasize, and again, maybe also to provoke, I really don't believe in intrinsic value. I don't think there is an intrinsic or like a objective quality to a work of art. I'm a sociologist, so I see this as a social process. So what is happening in the art world, what the art world really is about, is a continuous process of consensus making that goes very slow, where all kinds of people come in. Some voices are heard and taken seriously very much, others much less so, but it's a permanent dynamic process of consensus making where slowly over time there is a consensus forming about the importance of artist X and artist Y. And in the short run, and especially for contemporary art, it's an extremely brutal process. I mean, or was it you that was going through Art Forum of 2008? If you leaf through an art magazine of 10 years ago, you will find a lot of artists that were all the rage back then, and we have already forgotten about them. So that consensus-making process is very erratic there. So there are people that we are convinced of now that they are great artists, and in 10 years we don't believe that at all. The question is, of course, the ones where the consensus making is really in the direction of, yeah, that's an artist that we all agree upon. But even then, it's not completely fixed. Think of the classical European painting. Vermeer was not a great artist up until the 19th century. He was not considered a great artist. It's only from the 19th century onwards that consensus making made him into, well, that is one of the most important Dutch painters of the 17th century. So even on that level, that consensus is still changing, and that is why I don't believe in intrinsic quality, and that is why I also wouldn't, like if you ask me that question, I would more see it as a sociologist. It's a process of art historians, curators, museums, etc., all the time being with each other in dialogue, contesting each other's opinions, supporting each other's opinions, and that is how that consensus forms. And by the way, just one small remark about the previous question about what distinguishes a good from a bad investor, especially in contemporary art. It's luck. A good contemporary art investor is a lucky one. I mean, the whole problem, I think, especially with contemporary art, is that all the attention and all the media attention is going to that very small group of collectors who, with quite a bit of luck, made the right choices. So bought works by artists who then 10 years later, or 20 years later, or 30 years later, where the work went up in value enormously. But we are fooled by randomness, because for that 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 lucky collectors, there will be thousands who have basically lost their money. I mean, don't forget about that. When you buy a contemporary artwork in a gallery, the moment you walk out of the gallery with that work, it has lost its value, basically. Because for most of the artists that are around these days, they don't have a resale market to begin with. So you can buy them in the gallery, but you cannot resell them anymore. There will be, you cannot go back to the gallery to sell it back.
I think it's something like 95%.
95%
don't make it to the
that's the
secondary
number.
market,
Yeah.
something like that. So only 5% of the artists make it to
So
the
you better buy it, as you say, because you really have a passion for it, because you really like it, because you're into it, because you studied it, and you want to be living around that piece, not because you think it's going up in value that much.
Svetlana, I wanted to ask you, what do you think some of the similarities or differences are between the emerging Chinese market and some of the other emerging markets like Russia and Brazil, and if there are any parallels? Because for me, living in China, I always keep thinking, what are the parallels with the change from the art market from Europe to America, from the 20s to like the turn of the century? So are there differences with the emerging markets and also with other markets in history?
Thank you for your question. So maybe actually Olav would be the one to later address that question, though, because he really did a comparative study between the different BRIC countries. So there are not that many unique aspects to the Chinese contemporary art market's emergence, I think. So one would be auctions, the very strong position of auctions, so mainly due to the government involvement. Another one has to do with some historical particularities, so the presence of the official art organizations, so what we would call Kejia, right? So the Huayuan art academies and Xiehui, Xiehui. So artists associations that's all stem from previous centuries, but were re-established in the Maoist era, and were not artists who some would consider maybe not so contemporary, but living artists are active in. So there, for instance, value is established very differently than in the contemporary art market, and that's a unique way of establishing value for China. So if you are head of an artist association, or if you are a member of a Beijing Huayuan, so Beijing Art Academy, which is different from educational academy, right? So it's basically like a day job for an artist, where they make art 5 days a week, and then some of it goes to the States with different arrangements. So if you are at the top of this hierarchy in this official art system, your art would be more valuable than if you are a bit lower in this hierarchy. And if you lose your position in the hierarchy, or you retire, or then the value of your art immediately goes down. So that's, for example, a unique institution in China. So yeah, which is very different in Russia, for instance, where a similar type of organizations exist also from the Soviet era. We saw organizations that supported artists in the absence of the market, where artists were employed basically by these institutions, but these organizations in Russia now fulfill a very different role, and they certainly do not add value to the market of these artists, whereas in China they're very closely intertwined with the market.
Mei, I wanted to ask you about the index. What were some of the limitations that you found in building the index, and have you found it to be predictive of values of an artist's work?
I think first I'd like to maybe address
Sure.
the earlier question, which is the difference between sort of the Chinese collecting world versus the US. I think actually 10 years ago, I actually did some research on the Chinese auction market versus the US auction market. What's really interesting is that at the Shanghai stock, the China art market is very much like the Shanghai stock market. You have a lot of traders, but you have very few long-term investors. So for example, I think the number I remember is that actually for our database of sort of old masters, impressionists, and also contemporary, the average holding period for the overseas collectors, they are on average about 30 years. In China, the average collecting period is about 2 years. So you have a lot of traders. So sometimes actually you buy something at a spring auction, and then you just flip it in the different auction houses, also in the spring auction. So that's how fast they flip. So I think that's just really something that really strikes me as that actually is quite different in China versus sort of in the US. So going back to your question, sort of pricing of art, I think the limitation is that actually our database in some sense is actually quite limited. We only cover Sotheby's, Christie's, and also the Phillips. So we do not cover sort of emerging artists. And what's really interesting is actually sort of what you discover is that once it's covered by the three major auction houses, they actually stay there very long. So for example, let me just give you a number. Let's say for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which are the sort of, it includes the largest US companies. In 1900s, there were 33 companies. If you ask me right now how many they still exist in Dow Jones, the answer is 0. Actually, because recently GE was kicked out. So there is, but I think for the other 32, they probably no longer exist anymore. So the survival rate over a 100-year period is basically less than 3%. So what's interesting is that actually, well, we look at the same data. So for example, 1900, they were a Paris World Expo. So there were 100 artists actually at a time covered by the World Expo. And those artists and then their works were auctioned by Sotheby's and Christie's. And then I think roughly about 3 or 4 years ago, we look at the auction catalog and look at the same name, looking for the same names. We discovered that actually 92 of them, their works are still auctioned. So the survival rate is really, really high. So I always use this piece of information as advice for my students, mostly entrepreneurs. I say, you guys, if you want to leave a legacy, so that actually, 500 years later, your great-great-great-grandchildren, actually, if you want them to remember you, leave them with a piece of art, not leave them with some stocks, because they'll be worthless.
So we're getting conflicting information here. So you're saying that art is not a good investment, and then you're saying that this is a kind of legacy, it is a good investment.
For example, if you leave them with some stocks, even Jack Ma's Alibaba, 500 years later, my bet is probably will be worthless. But if you leave the kid with, a Picasso or Monet, or maybe a Qi Baishi or Zhang Daqian, I would bet that actually 500 years later, they will still be enormously valuable. Do you agree with me?
The problem would of course be how to identify the Picasso of our own days, and that's where the problem starts. That's such a difficult thing. I mean, if you would have in the 1870s or 1860s, if you would have bought art that was then completely fashionable and was commanding top prices, that's all been forgotten about. I mean, the Impressionists were, it took them decades before they got just a little bit of a reputation. And they were, what was being sold then in the galleries when the Impressionists were already creating the work, but everybody was looking down upon it. I mean, it was this kind of kitschy type of art that then became, it lost its value. So, and I think also in econometric work, and I think even also in work that you have been doing yourself with the index, it shows that art is not a good investment, or it's hardly outperforming just an average investment in stocks and bonds. And then you don't even take into account the huge transaction costs that are involved in investing in art, because don't forget about that, the people that were really happy about this are the auction houses, because on both sides, both from the seller and from the buyer, they take a 15-20% commission. So you have to take that off any investment that you might make. You first have to recoup all these transaction costs. So yeah, I think the consensus is in econometric work that it is not such a great investment.
Yes or no? Yes or no? My data is limited, so I think sort of, our work are conditional on sort of these are already great artworks already. They are already sold in Sotheby's and Christie's. So based on that, I think if you would ask me that actually, if you let's say have $100 billion and want to leave some wealth for future generations, if you ask me what to leave, I would advise you to actually have a huge, a significant percentage to be allocated in art rather than stocks. So I think sort of our own artworks sort of certainly indicate that actually art is not for traders. Certainly you don't want to sort of but on the other hand, if you are a long-term, let's say if you are a collector, like most overseas collectors, if you collect art piece for 30 years also, then transaction cost is not really that important because you get spread the cost over many, many years. Remember, actually, even if you buy stocks, if you buy a stock fund, they also charge management fees every year. So actually, after taking that into consideration, then what I remember is that actually art as a long-term investment, not short-term, as a long-term investment, their return is actually comparable to that of stocks. They do not exceed stocks, but they are comparable. So if you look at a 50-year period, I think the stocks earn roughly about 10.5%. Art earns about 10%.
But this is secondary market.
Yeah, this is secondary market. This is so I agree with you that actually for investing in emerging artists, contemporary artists, they are very much like you invest in somebody's garage operation, right? You could get like an Apple or a Jack Ma's Alibaba, but the odds are very, very small, and the failure rate is just tremendous. But on the other hand, if you have a portfolio of those, then maybe of already successful artists, I think they can be a small percentage of high net worth individuals' portfolio.
So final question before we open it up to the audience, but what if art is not such a great value investment for the most part, then why are people so drawn to it? Why are collectors so passionate? Why do the auction houses, what's driving this passion, this love, this like speaking to my soul that people talk about? What is that exactly? How do you explain that?
Well, maybe I can respond from my interviews with Chinese collectors, for example. So one reason seemed to be genuine love for art. So I met collectors who would say, well, I traveled abroad a lot, and every time I was somewhere I didn't know what really to do, to go to touristy places. But now every time I go abroad, I know where to go. I go to exhibitions, to galleries and to museums. And so there is this idea of searching for meaning. That's one thing, and another important aspect, of course, is the social and symbolic value of being a collector. So being a collector, of course, allows you entrance into certain social circles and allows you to showcase that you do not only have the means to acquire art, but also have the taste to go with it. So, and it seems to be important.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, adding to that, so especially to the social part of it, basically when you buy a work of art, you buy a ticket to a social world. And it's especially the art fairs that have understood that very, very well. You have to understand that until like 2 decades ago, art fairs were not that important. And there were not that many art fairs around the world. What made the art fair such a crucial and central institution in many countries is exactly the fact that they picked up on this social dimension of the art market. So this organization of fairs into this whole circus of social status, basically. So where as a collector you can hang out with companions from other cities, from other countries, so you can be part of this global elite that has a similar interest as you have. And also you can find out for yourself where you are in the hierarchy of that elite. So did you get access to the VIP opening, or to the VIP opening, or did you even get in before that into the fair? That tells you where you are in the hierarchy. Did you get invited to the opening of the Centre Pompidou tonight, or the one of tomorrow, or the one of Thursday, or do you have to wait with all the rest of us until it opens to the general public? Those are all ways in which a collector can find out where they are in the hierarchy. But so it's a mix of economic reasons, of social reasons, but I am also completely with you that there is a lot of real passion for it as well. And I don't like all the discourse in the art world that is looking down upon these nouveau riche collectors that are just, thinking about investment or about this social status game, because maybe it starts like that, but at least some of these people, they really then develop a true love for art, because they see something about themselves in it, or because they do it for heritage reasons. They want to document the rise of contemporary art in China, like Uli Sieg, the Swiss collector who put together this amazing collection of Chinese art. So all kinds of more meaningful reasons to buy that stuff, which, by the way, then go together with a willingness to pay for it, because it is only when you really love that work of art that you are willing to pay $10,000, $50,000 for a piece where you know rationally that it might lose its value. So how stupid can you be to spend so much money on that work? Well, only if you truly care about it.
So I want to give example of a little bit stupidity. Speaking of the famous Leonardo painting that people are still arguing the whereabouts, and the Louvre Museum is reluctant to include in the current show, the famous 450 million. Basically, when an auction like that happened, like what happened in November 2 years ago, was there were two phone bidders against each other, and when the price was over, I think 250 million, 300 million, and everybody in the room just watching back and forth like a ping pong ball. They're trying to wonder, they're trying to figure out how the bidding was going to end. So what we heard is each person over the phone assumed that the other person represents Qatar. So there's a rivalry between the Middle Eastern countries, right? Each phone bidder wanted to outbid the Qatar, so to speak, bidder, so they were fighting against each other. Apparently, the Qatar was not involved. That's how we end up with an interesting Leonardo painting at $450 million, where the authenticity, whether it's really by Leonardo, is still being argued. So just to complement what you said, the psychological element sometimes will end up in a scenario like this.